was a time when rock music did not feel manufactured. It was not built inside corporate boardrooms or designed around algorithms. It lived inside smoke-filled studios, late-night hotel rooms, endless highways, and musicians who played like every song might be the last thing they ever said to the world. In those years, the friendships felt real, the rivalries felt dangerous, and the music carried scars that audiences could actually hear. Few people witnessed that era as closely as Bobby Whitlock. Most casual listeners remember him as the soulful voice and keyboard player behind Layla and other assorted love songs, but the truth is far deeper than that. Whitlock stood in rooms where some of the greatest rock musicians of the 20th century created music that still echoes decades later. He watched genius collide with addiction. He saw friendships collapse under pressure. He saw men worshipped by millions quietly fighting battles nobody in the audience could see. And unlike many others from that generation, Bobby Whitlock survived long enough to remember it all clearly. The world often talks about the legends themselves, the guitar heroes, the frontmen, the icons frozen forever on magazine covers and old concert posters. But Bobby Whitlock experienced something different. He knew these men before history turned them into myths. He heard their fears when the microphones were turned off. He saw what success did to them behind closed doors. Some inspired him. Some frightened him. Some changed his life forever. And perhaps that is why his memories feel different from the polished stories usually told about classic rock. There is a sadness in them, a sense that an entire world disappeared long ago and never truly returned. Because the musicians Bobby Whitlock remembers were not simply talented performers, they were unpredictable, emotional, reckless. Brilliant men who helped build one of the most unforgettable eras in American and British music history. In this video, we look at 5 men Bobby Whitlock says rock music may never see again. From chaotic geniuses to quiet masters of their craft, each of them left a permanent mark on his life and on the sound of classic rock itself. Some were brothers to him. Some became cautionary tales. And one stood above all the others as the man audiences still cannot stop talking about more than half a century later. Before the fame, before the endless discussions about who wrote what during the making of Layla and other assorted love songs, and before classic rock radio turned those songs into permanent American nostalgia, Bobby Whitlock was simply a young musician trying to survive in a world overflowing with larger-than-life personalities. Born in Memphis, Tennessee, Whitlock grew up surrounded by the sound of gospel rhythm and blues and Southern soul music. Long before audiences knew his name, he had already absorbed the emotional style that would later make his voice impossible to mistake on records from the early 1970s. There was something deeply human in the way he sang. It sounded honest, weathered even when he was still young. His journey changed forever when he entered the orbit of Eric Clapton during the chaotic years after the collapse of Cream and Blind Faith. Clapton was already one of the most famous guitarists in the world, but fame had not brought him peace. By the time Bobby Whitlock joined what would become Derek and the Dominos, the atmosphere around Clapton was already filled with emotional tension, insecurity, obsession, and the growing darkness that would later define much of his personal life. Whitlock walked directly into that storm. But what made Bobby Whitlock different from many musicians around him was that he was never trying to become a polished celebrity. He came from a musical culture where emotion mattered more than image. In the studio, he was raw, instinctive, and deeply connected to the rhythm of Southern soul. That energy helped shape the sound of Derek and the Dominos in ways many younger listeners still do not fully understand today. The chemistry between Whitlock, Clapton, Carl Radle, and Jim Gordon gave those recordings a sense of emotional danger that polished modern rock music often lacks. Then came the arrival of Duane Allman. The moment Allman entered the sessions, everything changed. Bobby Whitlock later spoke about those days almost like someone remembering a beautiful accident that nobody could control. The music flowed naturally, but behind it stood exhaustion, addiction, emotional confusion, and enormous pressure. They were young men making immortal music while quietly destroying themselves in real time. Over the decades, Bobby Whitlock became one of the few surviving witnesses to that era who still spoke openly about it. While many rock documentaries focus only on fame and excess, Whitlock often sounded more reflective than glamorous. He remembered the laughter, the creativity, and the brotherhood, but he also remembered how fragile those men truly were. Some died young. Some disappeared into addiction, some became prisoners of their own legends. And through it all, Bobby Whitlock never forgot the men who shaped both his career and his understanding of what rock music once represented. Number 5. Jim Gordon. To audiences in the early 1970s, Jim Gordon looked like the kind of musician every rock band desperately wanted. He was calm, technically brilliant, and capable of adapting to almost any style placed in front of him. Producers loved him because he could make chaotic recording sessions suddenly feel organized. Fellow musicians admired him because his timing felt effortless. And to outsiders, watching Derek and the Dominos rise during the making of Layla and other assorted love songs, Gordon appeared to be one of the few stable personalities inside an increasingly unstable environment. But Bobby Whitlock would later remember a far more complicated man hiding behind that reputation. When Whitlock first worked alongside Gordon, the chemistry felt immediate. Jim Gordon played with a confidence that gave songs momentum without overwhelming them. Inside the studio, he seemed almost untouchable. The sessions were long, emotional, and often fueled by exhaustion, but Gordon could still sit behind the drums and somehow make everything feel alive. For Whitlock, that professionalism became part of what made Derek and the Dominos special. Everyone in the room brought something different emotionally, but Gordon's drumming held the structure together while everything else threatened to fall apart. Yet beneath the surface, tensions slowly grew. The atmosphere around the band was already unstable because of personal conflicts, drug use, and the emotional chaos surrounding Eric Clapton at the time. Bobby Whitlock later described those years almost like watching brilliant musicians burn too brightly for too long. Nobody stopped to think about consequences. Nobody imagined how dark things could eventually become. They were focused only on music touring, surviving the next session, and escaping their own minds for a few more hours. What made Jim Gordon unforgettable to Whitlock was not simply his talent, it was the tragedy of what happened afterward. As the years passed, Gordon's mental health deteriorated in horrifying ways that few people around him fully understood during the peak of his career. The man once respected as one of rock music's finest drummers eventually became associated with one of the most disturbing personal collapses in classic rock history. For Bobby Whitlock and others who knew him during the glory years, that transformation remained deeply painful because they remembered the version of Jim Gordon that existed before the darkness consumed him. Whitlock often spoke about musicians from that era with a mixture of admiration and sadness, and Jim Gordon represented both emotions perfectly. He remembered the incredible drummer who helped create timeless music, but he also remembered how fragile many of those men truly were beneath the fame. In the world audiences imagined classic rock legends seemed larger than life, in reality, many were struggling human beings, hiding serious, emotional, and psychological pain behind applause and success. And perhaps that is why Bobby Whitlock never forgot Jim Gordon, because Gordon represented something that defined the entire era itself. Extraordinary talent existing side by side with silent destruction. A generation of musicians capable of creating beauty while privately collapsing in ways few fans could see at the time. Number 4. Carl Radle. If Jim Gordon brought precision to Derek and the Dominos, then Carl Radle brought something far more difficult to describe. He brought calm. In a world filled with giant egos, emotional instability, addiction, and constant pressure, Radle carried himself with a quiet presence that many musicians trusted immediately. He was not the loudest person in the room. He rarely demanded attention. Yet Bobby Whitlock understood very early that the emotional heartbeat of the band often rested with Carl Radle more than audiences realized. Radle came from Oklahoma and had already built a reputation as an exceptionally reliable bassist before joining forces with Eric Clapton and Whitlock. His playing style was smooth, restrained, and deeply musical. Unlike bass players who tried to dominate recordings, Radle understood space. He knew when to hold back and when to subtly push the emotion forward. Bobby Whitlock later reflected on that quality with enormous respect because it allowed the songs of Derek and the Dominos to breathe naturally. Inside the studio during the creation of Layla and other assorted love songs, tensions often surrounded the group. The emotional chaos connected to Clapton's personal life was impossible to ignore. Drug use became increasingly common. Sleep disappeared. Emotions shifted constantly from excitement to exhaustion. Yet through much of that instability, Carl Radle remained dependable. Bobby Whitlock saw him as someone who genuinely loved music more than fame itself. That mattered because many musicians during the early 70s were already beginning to lose themselves inside celebrity culture. Radle never fully seemed interested in becoming a rock star stereotype. Whitlock also remembered the loyalty Radle showed toward Clapton during difficult periods. Even after Derek and the Dominos collapsed under emotional and personal pressure, Radle continued working alongside Clapton for years. Their musical connection remained strong long after the original dream of the band had faded away. To Bobby Whitlock, that loyalty revealed the kind of man Carl Radle truly was: quietly dependable, deeply committed, sometimes almost invisible to the public, despite being absolutely essential to the sound audiences loved. But, like so many musicians from that era, Radle's story did not end peacefully. Years of addiction and physical decline slowly damaged his health. By the time he died in the 1980s, many fans barely understood how important he had been to some of the most emotionally powerful recordings of the classic rock era. For Whitlock, that loss carried enormous sadness because he remembered not just the bassist, but the human being behind the music. He remembered the humor, the loyalty, and the emotional steadiness that helped hold fragile bands together during impossible moments. When Bobby Whitlock speaks about Carl Radle, there is often a sense of unfinished grief in his voice. Not because Radle chased headlines or controversy, but because he represented something increasingly rare in rock music. A musician who placed the music first. A man who understood brotherhood more than celebrity. Someone who helped create legendary songs without constantly demanding recognition for himself. And in many ways, Whitlock believed those kinds of men slowly disappeared from rock and roll long ago. Number 3. George Harrison. By the time George Harrison entered Bobby Whitlock's world, he was already one of the most recognizable musicians on earth. To the public, Harrison carried an almost mysterious image during the years following the breakup of the Beatles. He seemed quieter than the other former Beatles, more spiritual, more distant from the chaos of celebrity culture. But Bobby Whitlock would eventually discover that behind the calm exterior stood a man navigating enormous emotional pressure while trying to redefine himself outside the biggest band in music history. Whitlock first connected with Harrison during the intense creative period surrounding the early 70s rock scene, centered around musicians like Eric Clapton, Delaney, Bramlett, and many others moving through the same musical circles in Newmont, England, and America. At the time, these artists were not thinking about how future generations would analyze their friendships decades later. They were simply living through an explosive period of creativity, heartbreak, exhaustion, and fame that often blurred together until nobody knew where personal life ended and music began. What fascinated Bobby Whitlock about George Harrison was the contrast between his public image and his private reality. Fans saw Harrison as calm and deeply reflective, but Whitlock witnessed moments where the emotional weight surrounding Harrison became impossible to hide completely. The collapse of the Beatles had changed everything. Suddenly, Harrison was expected to prove himself outside the shadow of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, while still carrying the pressure of being permanently connected to the most famous band in modern history. Few people could truly understand that kind of burden. At the same time, Harrison's friendship with Clapton created emotional complications that later became part of rock mythology. The situation involving Pattie Boyd placed enormous strain on relationships that already existed under intense public attention. Bobby Whitlock stood close enough to witness how personal emotions could quietly reshape entire musical relationships. He saw admiration become tension, friendship become distance, and beneath all of it remained the uncomfortable reality that fame did not protect anyone from heartbreak or insecurity. Still, Whitlock never forgot Harrison's generosity as a musician. George Harrison respected talent deeply, and when he trusted someone creatively, he gave them room to contribute honestly. Whitlock admired that because many major stars during the 70s controlled every detail around them out of fear or ego. Harrison often seemed more interested in the feeling of the music itself than protecting his own image inside it. That openness helped create some of the era's most emotionally authentic collaborations. For Bobby Whitlock, George Harrison represented a strange contradiction that defined classic rock at its highest level. He was one of the most famous men in the world, yet often seemed uncomfortable with fame itself. He carried enormous success, yet still searched constantly for peace and meaning beyond celebrity. And perhaps that quiet searching is what Whitlock remembered most. Because beneath the legendary status and cultural influence, George Harrison still felt human in ways audiences rarely noticed while the world was busy turning him into an icon forever frozen in music history. Number 2. Duane Allman. For many people who lived through the golden years of Southern rock, Duane Allman did not feel like an ordinary musician. He felt almost supernatural. Stories about him spread through studios, concert halls, and late-night conversations like modern folklore long before the internet existed. Musicians spoke about his guitar playing with disbelief. Producers trusted him to transform songs within minutes. Audiences saw a wild intensity in him that could never be fully rehearsed or controlled. And when Bobby Whitlock remembered the making of Layla and other assorted love songs, one truth became impossible to avoid. The arrival of Duane Allman changed everything. Before Duane entered the sessions, Derek and the Dominos already had talent, emotion, and chemistry. But Whitlock later described the atmosphere after Allman appeared almost like a sudden electrical storm moving through the room. The energy intensified immediately. Eric Clapton finally seemed challenged in a way audiences rarely saw during that period. Instead of competing through ego, the two guitarists pushed each other creatively until the music became something larger than either man individually. Bobby Whitlock witnessed that transformation firsthand, and decades later he still spoke about it with amazement. What impressed Whitlock most was not simply Allman's technical ability. Plenty of musicians could play fast. Plenty could impress crowds for a few minutes. Duane Allman carried emotion inside every note. His guitar sounded wounded, joyful, restless, and dangerous all at once. In the studio, he often seemed completely consumed by the music itself. Whitlock remembered watching songs evolve naturally around him as though Duane somehow heard possibilities other musicians missed entirely. But like many legendary figures from that era, Duane Allman also lived with an intensity that felt impossible to sustain forever. The lifestyle surrounding rock music in the early 1970s rewarded excess constantly. Endless touring, sleepless nights, alcohol, drugs, emotional exhaustion, and sudden fame pushed musicians far beyond healthy limits. Bobby Whitlock saw how quickly young artists could become trapped inside their own momentum. Nobody slowed down because everyone feared losing the magic if they stopped moving. Then came the tragedy that permanently froze Duane Allman in rock history. His death at only 24 years old shocked musicians across America and Britain. For Whitlock, the loss felt deeply personal because he remembered not just the legend but the living human being inside the sessions. He remembered the laughter, the spontaneous creativity, the unpredictable energy, and the sense that Duane still had decades of music left inside him. Suddenly, all of it disappeared almost overnight. Whitlock later reflected that many younger listeners could never fully understand how powerful Duane Allman's presence truly felt during those years, because modern audiences mainly encounter him through old recordings and documentaries. But to the musicians who stood beside him, Duane represented possibility itself. He played like someone trying to reach something beyond ordinary music. And perhaps that is why Bobby Whitlock never forgot him. Because for one brief moment in rock history, Duane Allman made everyone around him believe they were creating something eternal. Number 1. Eric Clapton. No matter how many legendary musicians passed through Bobby Whitlock's life, one man always stood at the center of the story. Eric Clapton was not simply a bandmate or collaborator. He was the force that pulled many of these musicians together in the first place. By the time Whitlock entered Clapton's orbit, the guitarist had already become one of the most admired figures in rock music. Fans painted Clapton as God on walls in London years earlier. His work with the Yardbirds Cream and Blind Faith had turned him into something larger than an ordinary musician. Yet Bobby Whitlock quickly discovered that enormous fame did not bring Clapton peace. In many ways, it seemed to isolate him even more. When Derek and the Dominos formed, Clapton appeared desperate to escape the weight of his own legend. Whitlock remembered a man searching for authenticity while simultaneously struggling with obsession, emotional confusion, addiction, and the pressure of global fame. Clapton wanted the band to feel raw and honest, rather than polished like a typical superstar project. That desire helped create the emotional atmosphere that made Layla and other assorted love songs sound so alive decades later. But it also meant everyone inside the group became emotionally exposed in ways they could not fully control. Whitlock often spoke about Clapton with a mixture of admiration and painful honesty. He respected Clapton's musical instincts deeply because few guitarists could communicate emotions so naturally through their instrument. On stage, Clapton could make audiences feel heartbreak without saying a single word. In the studio, he chased emotional truth obsessively. That intensity inspired musicians around him, including Whitlock himself. Yet it also created instability because Clapton's personal struggles frequently shaped the atmosphere surrounding the band. The emotional chaos involving Pattie Boyd became part of rock mythology, but for the people living through it, the situation felt far less glamorous than later headlines suggested. Whitlock witnessed friendships strained under emotional pressure that nobody involved truly knew how to manage. Addiction slowly darkened the environment further. What audiences later romanticized as the tortured beauty behind Layla often felt deeply painful in real life to the people inside those rooms. Even after Derek and the Dominos collapsed, Whitlock never escaped the shadow of his connection to Clapton because the music they created together became permanently tied to rock history. Over the years, debates emerged about songwriting recognition and the true dynamics inside the band. Some relationships became distant, some wounds never fully healed. Yet, despite everything, Whitlock always seemed to understand that Clapton remained one of the defining figures of his life. Not because he was perfect, but because he embodied both the brilliance and the destruction that shaped classic rock during its most legendary years. For Bobby Whitlock, Eric Clapton represented something audiences still struggle to fully understand today: the reality that greatness often arrives carrying enormous personal darkness beside it. Clapton could inspire unforgettable music while privately battling fears and addictions that slowly consumed entire friendships around him. And perhaps that is why Whitlock never forgot him above all the others, because no other musician captured the beauty, chaos, sadness, and emotional intensity of that era more completely than Eric Clapton himself. By the time the 1970s faded into history, much of the world Bobby Whitlock once knew had already disappeared. Some of the men who helped create that unforgettable era were gone forever. Others survived, but carried emotional scars. Audiences never fully saw behind the records and magazine covers. The music remained immortal. Yet the people behind it slowly became ghosts, trapped inside old photographs, fading interviews, and songs still playing late at night on classic rock radio stations across America. For Bobby Whitlock, the memories never seemed entirely comfortable. When he spoke about those years, there was admiration in his voice, but also exhaustion. He remembered what it felt like before the world turned musicians like Duane Allman and Eric Clapton into permanent mythology. He remembered them as human beings first. Talented beyond belief, yes, but also vulnerable, emotional, reckless, and often deeply lost beneath the fame surrounding them. That may be why Bobby Whitlock's reflections feel so powerful to older audiences today. They come from someone who actually stood inside the storm rather than simply studying it years later through documentaries and headlines. He saw the exhaustion after the applause ended. He saw musicians trying to outrun loneliness through endless touring addiction or emotional chaos. And he also saw moments of genuine brotherhood that modern music culture sometimes feels incapable of recreating. In many ways, the men Whitlock remembered were products of a completely different world. A time when musicians still frightened record executives because nobody could fully control them. A time when albums mattered more than public image. A time when talent alone could pull strangers together long enough to create something timeless before everything eventually collapsed under pressure. That tension between beauty and destruction became part of what made classic rock unforgettable in the first place. Today, younger listeners discover songs like Layla and hear greatness. But Bobby Whitlock remembers the people behind the sound, the late nights, the unstable emotions, the laughter between sessions, the exhaustion hidden behind success, and perhaps most painfully of all, the realization that many of those men never lived long enough to understand how deeply their music would affect future generations. Maybe that is what Bobby Whitlock truly means when he says rock music may never see men like them again. Not because modern musicians lack talent, but because that era produced personalities too raw, too emotional, and too unpredictable to exist comfortably inside today's carefully controlled industry. They were flawed men who created unforgettable music while struggling to survive themselves. And decades later, the echoes of their lives still remain hidden inside every note.